So welcome to this another edition of the Swiss Polar Day. It is with the great pleasure that we are welcoming to Sion, to Alpo, which is a building that we at EPFL Valais share with the Swiss Polar Institute. This doesn't need any further demonstration. The importance of what you do is really great. And I think I'd like to thank you all for what you do and your great work. Before this building actually was the printing press of the local newspaper. So I think it's quite interesting because we used to print back in the day very high quality news for a local audience with a local impact. And now we're producing, global science with a global impact for a global audience.
I think it's fair to say that without Tony, but also without the young scientists, we wouldn't sit here today having this Swiss Polar Day. And so I think it has become the must-go event for everybody in Switzerland every year to exchange about polar science. I think there's also another person without which we wouldn't be here today, and that is Gabriela Schäfmann-Strub. And you may know that she stepped down as scientific director earlier this year. I think it's also time to say thank you for all the work that she did and all the service that she did during her time as scientific director.
Did you know that 50% of expeditions that failed to reach the summit of Mount Everest, that they cited teamwork as a main reason of their failure? Or did you know that up to 70% of medical errors in hospital are believed due to communication or teamwork failure? So teamwork is not just a nice to have. It is not just about success and performance, but in extreme environment, it is actually, or it can actually make a difference between life and death. So in the next 20 minutes, I'd like to talk about what makes an effective polar team. And I think the good thing is that you all here have experience with teamwork. You work in a team on a daily basis, probably in a research team, or even have experienced teamwork during a field trip to the Arctic regions or even Antarctica. So I'd like to start with a quick thought experiment. Think back to the worst team you ever worked with. And I'd like to hear a few words, maybe some buzzwords. How did that feel to work in this worst team? Yes. No care with others. Yes. Competition. So much training. Yes. Working in a bathroom can be very stressful and take a lot of energy. Running in circles. So ineffectiveness. One more. Distrusting. So a lack of trust. Yes, exactly. So now let's think back to the best team you ever worked with. How did that feel? Fun? Respect? Excuse me? Supportive? Supportive and probably trust. So the opposite of we heard before. So you can see we all have experience working in teams, and usually when we start working in a team, quite quickly we feel, oh, this is actually a nice team, a good team, or this teamwork is a bit challenging. But what is actually hard to identify the exact things, what makes a good team? What is it that make an excellent team excellent? And what is it that hinders teamwork in not so good teams? And that's exactly the overarching research question at our team at the University of Zurich. So we want to measure and identify team processes and states that makes teams effective, and eventually also apply training to improve teams. And we do research with all kinds of teams in most extreme environments, firefighting, medicine, Arctic, Antarctica. And we even have collaborations with the Space Agency where we use simulations for astronauts. And Monica postdoc in our team has a poster outside about that in case you're interested. So teamwork in the polar regions can arguably be a bit more challenging than in traditional settings because polar regions are so-called ice environments, pun intended, because in these environments, you are isolated, confined, and it is extreme. So isolated means you're away from your family, you probably won't have any means to communicate, maybe not even internet. You are often confined at a research station, on a boat, or even in a camp. And you have very little privacy. And this increases the risk for conflict and interpersonal tension. And of course, it's an extreme environment that makes teamwork hard. For example, the weather conditions are changing all the time. There is a threat from the outside that can lead also to negative emotions that need to be managed within the team. And one additional factor with teams in polar regions is that they constantly have to adapt. So you make plans, but because the environment is so dynamic, here are two examples. So a French team that got stuck in Hobart after their icebreaker stranded. And the other example of the researchers that also were stranded in Antarctica, they thought to believe to just wait a few hours, but then they had to survive several days until they could be rescued. So this adaptation process is what actually is very important with this team. So teams need to be able to be flexible and to be able to adapt. And that was the overarching research question of our research program. We started a research program in 2017 where we wanted to investigate how do teams adapt in extreme environments? And secondly, what are the enablers of team adaptation? So what helps teams to adapt? And I'd like to show you a few insights of this research program. We started this, as I said, in 2017 with the first expedition to Antarctica, where we went to Antarctica. We conducted interviews, over 60 interviews at 6 stations. We were literally walking from station to station, talking to people. We went to field trips with researchers to do observations and notes. And we also had a quantitative approach where we distributed surveys. And this all happened at King George Island in the Antarctic region. So I'd like to show you the overarching framework that we came up with, what makes team adaptive. But the very first question was, what actually are the challenges that these teams face? And generally, there are 3 categories. So the environment, the task, and the team that the teams have to adapt. In the environment, as you can see here, this was more or less 40% of the challenges. And it was mainly about the weather. So weather changes, you have plans, you want to go outside, but then the weather changes, you cannot go there, or you want to get some samples at a specific site, but it's not reachable because of the weather. So the teams, they constantly have to adapt to changes in the environment. Then the task itself is something that teams have to adapt to. So there, it was a lot about equipment. So equipment that either broke, then you couldn't get the data that you want, or you weren't able to analyze the data, or the equipment didn't even arrive in Antarctica. So we had several examples where researchers were waiting for weeks for their equipment in Antarctica to arrive. So these are just 2 situations where teams really have to adapt and make sure that they can actually do their task in Antarctica. And the third one, about 10%, is the team. So conflict in the team was always a big one. As I said, due to the confinement and isolation, the risk is higher for tensions. And this can have a negative impact on the success of the mission, of course. So based on our data that we assessed, I would like to walk you through the theoretical framework that we came up with, what makes teams adaptive. And here we have different things. So we have what happens before the mission, then what happens within the mission. And this all leads to this capacity of a team to be able to adapt. And let's start with the pre-mission. So what kind of team do? That is not so surprising. Of course, the planning is a big aspect, training and selecting people. And with selection, what we heard often is that researchers told us that they have to select people that are flexible, that are mentally flexible. And this is already one indicator of maybe personality traits that leads them to better adaptation during the mission. When teams actually are in the field, I would like to start with how adaptation actually happens and then come back to the enablers for adaptation. So the adaptation processes, we have team process management, resource management, and external emotional regulation. Team process management is actually the processes of communication, for example, or negotiation if something happens. So how a team negotiates after a challenge. This back and forth, okay, how do we solve it, coming up with new plans. So as a reaction to a challenge. Then resource management is a very important part because in the Arctic regions, resources are always limited. And you cannot just go out and buy new equipment, right? So it's always about managing resources, and especially if equipment breaks, you have to see if there's something else, someone else at the station who has this equipment, or maybe get in contact with other stations to borrow equipment there, or even build new equipment. So you constantly have to manage the resources. We saw some very innovative examples also of researchers who built by themselves equipment to get some data that's actually very expensive, but just with the things they found at the station, they were creative and they built new tools and could adapt to these challenges. And the third one, a very important part, external emotion regulations. I mentioned before that extremeness can lead to strong emotions. Being at Antarctica or Arctic regions, you are isolated, and that is also stressful, right? And this leads to emotions, and teams need to regulate, especially the negative emotions. And here, one example. So in these ice environments, maybe we react a bit differently than we would react at home, right? Because there are external stressors that make us maybe a bit more tense, a bit more stressed, and we need to be aware of that. And in another study, we actually looked at daily emotions in research. So here, an example of a study that we conducted with a research team, actually just 2 researchers, and they, over the course of 2 weeks, they filled out a survey 3 times a day about their affective reactions. These are simple questions. How do you feel at the moment? And 3 times a day, independently, they filled out these surveys on their phones. And you can see here, even without statistical analysis, that emotional experience on the left positive and on the right negative is almost identical. But keep in mind, they did this separately from each other. So it seems that within this team, there was similar emotional experience. And there are 2 reasons. One, of course, this research team worked very close and they had similar experience. If they had a success, this boosted positive emotions, or if something went wrong, this had an impact on negative emotions. But also there's this thing about emotional contagion in teams, especially if you're isolated, and this lack of privacy even makes this stronger. So you might know that in a team, when you have someone who's really in a good mood, this is somehow contagious, right? And the same is true with the negative emotions. If someone is feeling bad or even depressed, this has an impact on other team members. And that's why, especially in these isolated environments, it is important to manage these emotions. Here an example from one of our interviews about emotion regulation. So there was a case where one researcher got bitten by a seal and he got an infection, and they had to wait 2 days to get rescued. And these researchers, they very vividly told us how they keep the good mood up in the team. So even the patient was always joking. And here a quote, "I never seen a group that managed to keep a good humor with the ill person himself. Trying to encourage him, we managed to save him just in time." So even this person was really almost dying because of this infection. They tried to be fun, humorous, and keep the good mood up. Another example that another story that we heard is from the Chilean station, Escudero. Here, this is close to the airport at Punjab Island. And a lot of researchers, before they fly out, they stop at Escudero for maybe one night or a few hours until their flight goes. And what happened is that at one time there was bad weather and there were no flights for over a week. So a lot of researchers got stuck at Escudero station. In Escudero, they have around 30 beds. And at that point, they had up to 60 or 70 researchers at the station. And they were lying on the floor, sleeping really literally on the floor, which of course led to very tense interactions at the station. And one researcher or station staff actually told us the story that what he did, we started a Game of Thrones marathon to relax and have fun. So that was their simple strategy to manage these tensions and keep the people busy and avoiding conflict, hopefully. So let's talk about the enablers and actually what makes a team adaptive. And that is the interesting part, I think, of our project. And here we have 3 processes: community engagement, socializing, and daily planning. Community engagement, that means usually, especially at the stations in Antarctica that we experience, you have a strong sense of community. And any person in Antarctica is a resource. And because the resources are limited, we need to use these resources and we need to contribute to the community. And this can be simple things like setting the breakfast table for a friend that isn't here yet, or support other research or staff in their tasks. So just showing a genuine interest in other research and in the community helps the teams later on adapt in case something happens. And we'll come to that. The second process, or here a quote, yes, first, there is always someone willing to help. You come here and you must have the full support of everyone. The first thing we do is we approach the person and say, what do you need? What can we help you with? And that's also what we experienced when we were there. There was this supportive culture in the community that on one side, of course, you need to contribute, but it's very nice and even leads to people wanting to go back again and again. And we heard a lot of story of researchers that went to Antarctica for 15, 20 years, and they talk about the people there as their family, their second family. So they're almost addicted to this being on Antarctica, which is a very interesting phenomenon. Then the second one is socializing. This is the collective process of engaging in social interaction that builds and sustains social ties. And as I said, we need a network in Antarctica, and we need to build these relationships. And in our paper, we call it also social lubricant, which increases friction and eases communication that you have with relationships within your team, but also with other teams. You need a network here to do the job well in a project. Several small groups working together to share certain tasks. Then there's the station staff, doctors, military, etc., who support us. So you need to think of the whole network on the station and other stations that you need to build in order then to be adaptive, because that is a resource that you can use to then adapt to challenges. how does this look like? Here are a few examples from our own experience. In Antarctica, there is always time where you have to wait. On the top left, that was the third day that we were waiting at the station to fly out because of bad weather. And you just use this time to talk to people, to connect, or even play is an interesting thing. You participate with other people. You might not talk the same language, but when you play, this all helps. And we especially had the experience to experience Chinese New Year in Antarctica at the Chinese station. And we, were forced to contribute to their cultural activities there. We also saw some negative examples. So people who don't socialize, and people were plainly telling us people won't really be as ready to help her if she has problems with social interactions. So that was talking about the researchers who always at night went to their room, reading and being for herself. And even another example, when scientists first come, I will be more prone to helping them if they come say hello during meals, chat with us in a nice way, and then talk about the equipment of their problem. And we also like having fun. So let's have fun together and get to know each other first. So people at Antarctica were really telling us, if you don't contribute to our community, then talk to us. We're less likely to help you if you have problems. And then the third and last process is daily planning. And here we saw that teams that regularly planned every day and also reflected about their day were more adaptive. And planning means also contingency planning, because there are always things going wrong. So define a plan A, then plan B, C, and D, and also adapt your plans on the go. And the reflection part is also an interesting thing. So every day there were teams that came together. They did so-called debriefing, where they just thought about what went well today, where can we improve, and what will we do differently tomorrow. And this reflection, and we know that also from the research, it has a very strong contributed to team adaptation. Here a quote of two researchers about this reflection. We evaluated the day on the way back from the field trip and asked ourselves what went well today, where can we improve, and what will we do differently tomorrow. We both talked about how we reached the goals and that we got more done than expected. We definitely felt proud and we were in a good mood. So to bring everything together, we identified some pre-mission processes that help with adaptation, and then more importantly, what you can do during the mission. And now this community engagement, socializing, and daily planning. Of course, if you have established good relationships, then it is easier to communicate if something happens during crisis. It is easier to manage the resources because you have this network that you can go to, that you can seek help. And of course, it is also easier to regulate emotion, because if you have established a network, then you can talk to people. You can get help from other people. And this all leads to better adaptation. So we simplified this model in a book chapter that you can download for free. The book chapter is called The ABC of Effective Antarctica Teams. And if you want to take home something from my talk, then it is these three things. If you go to Antarctica or Arctica in an extreme environment, anticipate, build and maintain social relationships, and collectively reflect with your team. Thank you very much.
We have time for 2 or 3 short questions if you have any now. Yes.
Hello. Thanks for the nice talk. Very interesting. I'd be curious, you said 10% of the people mentioned team as one of the challenge. Do you know how that compares to teams working here in our cozy environments and not in ice environments? Because I imagine that people are way more likely to complain about the team if you are not in an extreme situation.
Yeah, very good question. I personally don't have specific data about that. But I was actually surprised that it's only 10%. I would have expected that it's even more. And I think we have to keep in mind that these were summer campaigns, which is from 2 weeks to maybe 2 months. And if it's even longer, then probably this might be even higher. And I think in everyday work, you can avoid the friction much better. I think that's the thing, right? At night, you go home to your family, you relax, but you cannot do that in Antarctica. You have to even share a room with your teammates. And if some frictions happen, maybe it's much more likely to then lead to a conflict because you cannot avoid it. This can be a good thing, but also a bad thing. A good thing because you have to face your conflicts. You have to talk about it, right? You cannot avoid it. And that's what we see, that sometimes if a conflict breaks out, can be good for the team if they finally start talking about things that they weren't telling each other. And then the next day that will much better because they talked about this. And that's why the reflection part is also important. Because when I talk about reflections about where can we improve in terms of tasks, but also in terms of teamwork. How do we work as a team? How do we want to work as a team? These are simple questions that you even should do before going there, just to have a shared understanding. How do we want to work with each other?
I think I might have missed something in that talk, but I'm not sure if you actually defined what you mean by team. And I'm not sure if you are taking into account cultural relations between different countries or different methods of operating, because something doesn't feel like needed to work.
The first definition of team, like team or teamwork. Definition of team, I mean, the official definition of a team is a group of people who has a common goal. Very basic, right? But what does that mean? In Antarctica, what we experienced it's much more. So you have the research team, they have their research, but then you're together with other teams who have maybe similar interests, maybe some shared goals, but maybe some conflicting goals. So we looked at research teams who went there with the goal of doing their research. That was our definition. And about the cultural part, yes, of course, we saw a lot of this. We couldn't take it into our research like as a specific predictor because it was so diverse. We had a lot of different cultures. We were at 4 Latin American stations, then 2 Asian stations, which obviously were very, very different culturally. And especially when we talk about building social relationships, this is very different on a Chilean station versus the Chinese station. On the Chinese station where we stayed, we needed like 3 to 4 weeks until we could actually really just talk to these people. That's how this was and what other researchers told us. But on the Chilean station, the second day, they invited us to their parties and they organized some dancing and play. So it was much faster. And that was just the culture how it is. But these are just 2 examples. And of course, there are many more, and you need to be aware of them.
Jan, we own and operate a camp in the Ellsworth Mountains, so 80 degrees south, which is based on basically taking mountain climbers, people skiing to the South Pole, people as tourists flying to the South Pole. So we run a very big camp, 80 people, 85 people. Support camp. It involves mechanics, pilots, doctors, cooks, communications people, and whatever. So we've got a diverse camp, 20 plus different nationalities. One of the things that your statistics didn't look at is the hot potato topic of sexual harassment, gender mixing. Have you done much research on that, where we're facing issues there, where we've had complaints of sexual harassment at times. We've tried to deal with it. But in your building of teamwork, are you taking that into account now? Because it's really a social issue.
To be honest, we came across this. I cannot talk about this at the moment because it's a very, very hot topic, as you say, and this involves like the station and organizing how, et cetera, et cetera. It is there, and we saw that, but we were not able to go there, to be honest.
But I would like, I'm sorry that we're ending on this hard note because it's true, it's the elephant in the room at the moment. And it has its rightful place in the discussions. It is such a huge issue. If you do more work on this, we'd be very happy to work on and discuss also how you create a team without any harassment, be it sexual or emotional or of any other type. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm sure lots of people will enjoy talking to you.